The next thing we kind of wanted to address here is like some of the like more like philosophical arguments against divine simplicity. So I'd love to get into a few of those. One of them I think is a very more recent thing that you come up with Joe Schmid on like the aloneness argument, which is interesting. I've heard, I think it was Joe that talked about it once. But could you like kind of break that down and like what's going on there? Because it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, so Joe and I are still trying to figure out the best ways to popularize this. So this is based on, this is a paper called The Aloneness Argument Against Classical Theism that's going to be in religious studies. It's forthcoming in religious studies. And so what we do in the paper is we look at some different classical claims and then say there's like some kind of inconsistency between them. So we kind of focus on God's freedom, omniscience, and simplicity. And so let me kind of give you like, I guess like some brief definitions of those things, and then I can give you like a sort of abbreviated version of how you could develop this sort of argument. So classical theism says that God is free to create the universe, or maybe a different universe altogether, or he's free to like just say like, I don't want to create anything at all. And so there's all these different genuine possibilities. So it's a genuine possibility that God could exist completely alone, because it's a genuine possibility that God not create anything at all. And so it is contingency, is the contingency of God's, what's God's called like God's transitive will, that's said to ground the contingency of the universe. Now, further classical theism also says that all of God's knowledge is self-knowledge. So what that means is that all of God's knowledge is about his own nature and his own action, or what he's like causally determined or decreed to come about. And so here's what you do with the argument here. So the first step of the abbreviated version of the aloneness argument says, well, just establish that God has contingent knowledge. And this is pretty easy to do when you just reflect on the classical claims that I mentioned above about God's freedom and omniscience. So if God is omniscient, then God has some contingent knowledge. So some of the content of God's knowledge is contingent because God's knowledge is grounded in God's contingent and free action pertaining to his decree that a particular universe and a particular timeline exist. And if God is omniscient, then God will know that he contingently created our universe. And then God knows that his act of creating this universe is contingent because he knows that he could have created a completely different universe. Or he could have just existed completely alone. So God's got some sort of contingent knowledge. Here's the second step of this abbreviated argument. So you just remind people what simplicity says. And so as a reminder, simplicity says that whatever is intrinsic to God is identical to God. So for example, everything in God must be identical to God's absolutely necessary essence and existence. And the overwhelming majority of classical theists say that God's knowledge is intrinsic to God. So given simplicity, God's knowledge is going to be identical to God. And so that's why you see people like Catherine Rogers or St. Bonaventure say that God just is his act of knowing, creating, and providentially governing this universe. Here's step 3. So step 3 of this argument, what you do is you derive a contradiction from everything that I just said. So divine simplicity says that God's knowledge is identical to God's essence and existence. Well, God's essence and existence are absolutely necessary, and nothing contingent can be identical to anything that is absolutely necessary. And so this is where you get a problem. God has contingent knowledge. And again, simplicity says that God's knowledge is identical to God's existence. But if God's knowledge is contingent, then God's knowledge cannot be identical to God's absolutely necessary existence. So we can drive a contradiction here. God's knowledge is identical to God's existence, and God's knowledge is not identical to God's existence. So at that point, you should just be like, okay, paale, yo quiero, finito. Like, this is like game over. Like, what are you going to do? So what the proponent of divine simplicity has to do at this point is they have to reject something that led to the contradiction. But here's the problem. All the stuff that leads to the contradiction is like key claims of divine simplicity in the classical tradition. So if you're rejecting one of the claims that led to this contradiction, you're going to actually be rejecting like some aspect of classical theism, and that's not like a good way to go when you're trying to defend classical theism. So that's a very serious problem.
So if you're going to say like, well, maybe God's knowledge isn't equal to God's existence, or the same as God's like existence, then you kind of run into this idea where you have like parts or something with God, and it's like kind of like a key part of classical theism, and it just kind of falls apart from there, is what you're thinking?
Part of it, yeah. So one response to what we do in the paper, the way we develop the argument there, is to say, well, it can't be like God's contingent knowledge can't be an accidental or contingent feature of God, because simplicity says no accidental properties, no contingent features. So that's got to go. So what else are you going to be left with? And so it seems like your options are dwindling really quickly at that point.